economy that help promote and sustain that increase in per capita real GDP? What is the setup of the nation itself that helps do this? The first one's strong property rights. Um, the idea that what you have is yours and you can do what you want with it definitely helps encourage innovation and things like that. Second one, patents and copyrights. This is unbelievably important to make sure that innovators know that they are going to be the ones that get to profit off of their idea or invention for at least 20 years if it's a patent and longer for a copyright. Uh, the example here, which is very timely, it takes drug companies about $1 billion to research, patent, and test new drugs because for every drug that does succeed, there are many that fail. And no one would do this unless they knew that they would be allowed to profit off of it. After the 20 years, those drugs go off patent, and then anyone can manufacture and sell it, and that's where you get generics. Literacy and widespread education, go tartan. Um, we need an educated populace. If we don't have an educated populace, things do not get invented or innovated. We need efficient financial institutions. We need there to be banks to give out loans to people who are seeking them to start a new company or new production method or innovating and inventing takes time, takes money, and we need a strong banking system in order to be able to facilitate loans. Free trade. Trade promotes growth. Um, the joke often is that, all our clothes and trinkety stuff comes from China, but at the end of the day, we want China to produce that stuff because they can specialize it and get really good at it, and then we don't have to make it, and it frees up our resources to do other things. And when economies specialize, it frees up resources so that we can innovate and we're going to see more growth. Competitive market system is definitely helpful in this. Um, it this is all about efficiency, making sure we're not wasting resources, making sure we're not producing goods and services that people don't want, and the market system helps us figure that out. And then social, cultural, political environment. Uh, in the United States, we have an environment that it is considered good to be an innovator and an inventor, to make money. We have a social and cultural environment where nothing is really taboo. If you want to make something, go for it. There's not um, many regulations on what you can and cannot produce or create. Our social philosophy is said that wealth is good and we would like to have it. And that's kind of the setup. And we also have a positive attitude towards work and risk taking, which is all helpful when it comes to institutional promoting growth. What we have in the United States definitely lends towards growth. What are the six main factors that affect the rate of economic growth? So we know growth varies wildly from country to country, but there are six things that we can use to kind of explain it. And we call them our ingredients of economic growth. And we're going to group them into four things. Supply factors are not four things, sorry. We're going to group them into three categories: the supply factors, a demand factor, and an efficiency factor. So when we talk about economic growth, bring it back to our production possibilities frontier. Four things that are going to come to growth from the supply side would be increase in quantity or quality of natural resources or land, increase in the quantity quality of human resources or labor, increase in the supply of capital goods, and improvement in technology. The supply factors are our four things that are going to shift our production possibility curve. increase in quantity and quality of resources, and improvement in technology. The fifth ingredient is the demand factor. The demand factor is the idea that in order for us to get higher production, those supply factors to take place, we need people to buy it. There's got to be some demand. Households, businesses, and governments have to buy it. So, consumption, investment spending, and government spending, uh, we need people to buy what we're producing because if they're not buying it, there's no reason to supply it. The sixth factor is our efficiency factor. This is to be at our full production potential, we need economic efficiency. We need to be using resources in the best possible way, in the least costly way, productive efficiency, and then we want to be making what people want, that allocative efficiency. These factors are very much related. Um, you can see unemployment caused by insufficient total spending, which is a demand factor, could lower the rate of new capital, which is a supply factor, and delay spending on research, another supply factor. Um, so, all this to say, economic growth is a dynamic process that's ever changing, and there's going to be a lot of interaction between the supply, demand, and efficiency factors that are taking place. And depending on what's happening with one, it's going to influence the other. So let's bring it down to the production possibilities model. So if you remember our production possibilities model, we've got curve AB, right? This shows anything on the curve like point A is efficiency. Our growth would mark our shift from AB to curve CD. That represents economic growth. The shift out from curve AB to CD. The demand factors, it's the supply factors that are going to shift us from AB to CD. It's the demand factor that's going to decide, are we going to move from point A out to point B or even to point C, or where we're going to move. The ability to produce more is reflected on our curve CD, but unless there's demand, we're going to stay in here at point A where we're going to have unemployment. When our demand factor, if there is more demand, we're going to see this shift outward towards C. And then the last bit of this is the efficiency factor. That's going to determine on whether or not we fully get to the curve. If we've got all of these working, let's say our optimal combination of goods and services is point B, that's where we would be if there was the demand and we were being efficient. And how would we figure out if point B was the optimum? Marginal analysis. Good. So when we increase the size of our labor force, right? It's been going up every year in the United States. That increases our productive capacity. That's the shift from curve AB to CD. But getting the extra output that these added workers can produce depends on if they're able to find a job. And jobs are only going to exist if people are buying goods and services. And so that's that demand factor. When we see our total spending increase at the same amount as our productive capacity, we're going to move from that point A out to point C and beyond that new curve. Or point B, I'm sorry. I forgot that B was the curve. Any combination that's not on our curve is going to be this C, our underutilization of resources. And if you remember what we talked about in a previous thing, macroeconomically speaking, we want to be at point C. And the reason why We want to be as close as we can to the curve, but not actually on it. Because if we're on the curve, that means we're using every single resource we have in the economy. And if we're trying to produce anything else, or we're trying to produce more of something, it's going to cause inflation. What are the impacts of labor resources on economic growth? So, the demand and the efficiency factor are important, but they don't matter if we don't have the supply factors happening first. If we don't have that first shift of our possibilities to produce, so we're going to focus on the supply factors. And we can increase our real output and income two ways: by increasing our inputs, of productive resources, by having more land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, or by increasing the productivity of those inputs. So let's talk about that. I love this diagram because it shows how our supply determinants matter. How do we get GDP from this? So first, we've got our inputs, our labor inputs, the hours of work that are happening in an economy. Then we've got our labor productivity. How much output are we getting from our inputs? So this times this, we're going to get GDP. Hours worked times what is being produced per hour gives us real GDP. So real GDP is going to be hours of work times labor productivity. So if we want to increase real GDP, we either have to increase our hours of work, which would be our labor inputs, or increase their productivity. Suppose that a hypothetical economy, ZIAM, has 10 workers in year one, each working 2,000 hours for a year, 50 weeks at 40 hours per week, right? So our hours of work is going to be 20,000 hours. If the average output is $10, GDP in ZIAM is going to be $20,000. I'm sorry, $200,000. So to increase this number of real GDP, we could either increase hours of work or increase labor productivity. So let's say hours work rise to 20,200 and labor productivity rises to 1040. Then our real GDP is going to go up to $210,080. That would be a growth rate of 5% that year. That's a great growth rate. Our Council of Economic Advisors uses what's called growth accounting to figure out, all right, if we're trying to use these supply factors, how do we know which one's most important? And if you had to guess which one was most important, what do you think it is? Okay, we'll see if you're right. The system groups the supply factors into two main categories: increases in hours of work and increases in labor productivity. If you see, our increases in real GDP definitely come much more from increases in labor productivity than quantity of labor. And we actually have seen some dips in quantity of labor, and part of that has to do with baby boomers retiring, tougher immigration laws. It can go one of a few ways. So increasing labor inputs is either you've got to increase the number of workers or increase the number of hours people are working. So this is all about worker hours. Like I said, increase it two ways. Increasing labor productivity, this is going to be increases in land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, or improve technology, improve productivity. We're going to see that labor productivity mostly comes from technological advance. Increases in